Welcome to Midnight Stories, where the tales never end. Dive into a world filled with mystery, drama, and heart-pounding suspense. If you love stories that keep you guessing, please subscribe to our channel so we can continue this journey together. The Wednesday Strangler. 7 victims. 6 Wednesdays. One killer who was never found. Saga Prefecture, Japan. A quiet rural region where small towns were surrounded by rice fields, narrow roads, and mountains in the distance. In the 1970s, life there moved slowly. People knew their neighbors. Children walked home from school. And after dark, the streets became almost completely silent. But in 1975, something happened that would eventually turn that quiet region into the center of one of Japan's strangest unsolved murder cases. Her name was Tomiko Yamasaki. She was only 12 years old. On a Wednesday in 1975, Tomiko disappeared. At first, there was nothing that immediately suggested murder. A child was missing. Police searched. Her family waited, and the community hoped that she would somehow return. But she never did. Years passed. Then, in 1980, another young woman disappeared. Her name was Ritsuko Hyakutaki. She was 19. And once again, the disappearance happened on a Wednesday. At this point, nobody was connecting the two cases. They were separated by 5 years. Different victims, different circumstances, and there was no obvious evidence that the same person was responsible. But then another woman disappeared, and another. The disappearances slowly began forming a disturbing pattern. Women and girls were vanishing from the same general region, and increasingly, Wednesday seemed to be the day when the nightmare began. By the time investigators realized that the cases might be connected, years had already passed. And somewhere in Saga Prefecture, a killer may have been watching, waiting, and learning, because the first case had disappeared into history, but the pattern was only beginning. In 1981, another woman disappeared. Her name was Chizuko Ikegami. She was 27 years old. Like the victims before her, she disappeared without leaving behind a simple explanation. There was no dramatic crime scene, no obvious witness who could point directly to a suspect, no killer standing in the shadows waiting to be caught. Instead, there was absence. A person was there, and then she wasn't. Investigators began looking at the previous disappearances differently. Tomiko, Ritsuko, Chizuko. Could these cases actually be connected? Then came another case. A girl only 11 years old disappeared in 1982. Once again, the investigation produced few answers. The community became increasingly uneasy because something was happening, but nobody knew exactly what. The victims were not all the same age. They did not all live identical lives, and there was no obvious connection between them. But there was one detail that investigators could not ignore. The day, Wednesday. The disappearances were beginning to look less like random events and more like a pattern. But patterns can be dangerous because once investigators believe a pattern exists, they may start seeing connections everywhere. The challenge was proving that the connection was real, and if there really was a killer responsible for these disappearances, he had something investigators feared most: time. Years had passed between some of the crimes, and whoever was responsible appeared to understand how difficult it was to investigate a missing person case with little physical evidence. Then, in 1987, another woman disappeared. Her name was Sumiko Fujis. She was 48. This time, investigators would eventually find something horrifying: a body. The case was no longer simply about missing people. Now there was evidence that someone was killing, and the investigation entered a completely different phase. Sumiko Fujis had disappeared in 1987. Investigators eventually discovered her remains, and the discovery changed everything. The authorities now had a homicide investigation, but the killer was still invisible. There was no obvious murder weapon, no reliable eyewitness, no clear motive, and no confirmed identity. Then, in 1988, another woman disappeared: Kiyomi Nakajima, 50 years old. Once again, investigators searched. Once again, the case ended with horrifying evidence. Another woman was dead. And then came 1989. A 37-year-old woman named Tatsuyo Yoshino disappeared. Her disappearance would become one of the most important events in the entire case, because 3 of the later victims were eventually found dead in roughly the same area. 3 women, 3 deaths, a pattern stretching across years. And suddenly investigators were looking at something that appeared to be much bigger than a series of unrelated disappearances. The media began giving the unknown killer a terrifying nickname: the Wednesday Strangler. The name came from the recurring Wednesday connection and the manner in which several victims had died. For the public, the story was terrifying. Imagine living in a small community where people knew each other, then discovering that somewhere among you might be a killer. Someone who could appear completely normal. Someone who could go to work, buy groceries, talk to neighbors, and then, perhaps on Wednesday, choose another victim. Fear spread. But police needed more than fear. They needed a suspect. And eventually, they found one: a man who appeared to have connections to the final murders. The investigation now seemed to be approaching its conclusion. After more than a decade, perhaps the Wednesday Strangler had finally been identified. But what happened next would make the case even more complicated. The police focused on a man who became the central suspect in the final 3 murders. Investigators believed they had finally found the person responsible. The case against him began to take shape. There were statements, there were accusations, and eventually there were alleged confessions. For investigators, it must have looked like the breakthrough they had been waiting for. 14 years, 7 victims, and finally, a suspect. But a confession is only powerful when it survives scrutiny. And this one would not. The suspect later denied the accusations. Questions began surrounding the interrogation process. Were the statements reliable? Had investigators pressured him? Were the details consistent with physical evidence? And most importantly, could the prosecution actually prove that this man was the killer? The case went to court, and instead of a straightforward conviction, the prosecution faced serious problems. Evidence connected to the suspect was challenged. Some details of the alleged confession did not fit cleanly with the known facts. Then came an even more important development: DNA evidence. DNA testing was becoming increasingly important in criminal investigations, and biological evidence connected to the murders was examined. But instead of providing the final confirmation investigators wanted, the evidence raised more questions. The prosecution's case was weakening. The man accused of being the Wednesday Strangler maintained his innocence. And eventually, the court reached a stunning conclusion. He was acquitted. The suspected killer walked free. For the families of the victims, this was devastating, because the trial had failed to answer the most important question. If this man wasn't proven to be the killer, then who was? An acquittal does not necessarily mean that investigators know who committed a crime. It simply means the evidence was not sufficient to legally establish guilt. And in the Wednesday Strangler case, that distinction became crucial. The man who had been accused of the final murders was no longer the answer. But the murders still existed. 7 victims, years of fear, and no confirmed killer. The investigation had reached a dead end. Yet, the case contained another disturbing possibility. What if the real killer had never been the man who was arrested? What if investigators had spent years following the wrong trail? The earlier victims were particularly difficult to understand. Some had disappeared without their remains being recovered. Others were found only after significant time had passed. Evidence deteriorated. Memories faded. And witnesses could no longer remember every detail. That is one of the biggest problems in a long-running murder investigation. Time doesn't just pass. Time destroys evidence. A witness forgets. A document disappears. A crime scene changes. Technology advances. And a suspect can change his appearance, his job, his location, and his entire life. For the victims' families, however, time does not erase anything. They still wanted answers. Who killed their daughters? Who killed their wives? Who was responsible for taking 7 lives? And why Wednesday? Was it truly a deliberate signature? Or was the Wednesday connection simply a coincidence created by the way the cases were recorded? Investigators could not prove it, and that uncertainty became one of the most haunting aspects of the case, because the nickname suggested a pattern. But a nickname isn't evidence. The truth was buried somewhere inside the case files, and possibly inside the memories of someone who had never spoken. The Wednesday Strangler case is disturbing not simply because of the murders. It is disturbing because of what remains unknown. 7 victims, multiple investigations, a suspect who was ultimately acquitted, and no universally accepted identification of the real killer, there are questions that continue to surround the case. Why were so many victims associated with Wednesdays? Was the killer deliberately choosing that day? Did the victims know their attacker? Was there a specific reason for the locations where some bodies were found? And how could someone remain unidentified for so many years? Perhaps the most frightening possibility is also the simplest. The killer may have looked completely ordinary. There was no requirement that a serial killer look like a monster. He could have been a neighbor, a coworker, a customer, someone seen repeatedly by the people investigating the murders. And if he was responsible for multiple crimes over more than a decade, he may have become very good at avoiding detection. The later murders gave investigators more evidence, but the earlier cases remained deeply mysterious. The passage of time had created gaps that might never be filled, and even modern forensic technology cannot always solve a case when the original evidence is missing, damaged, contaminated, or never collected. For the families, the word unsolved carries enormous weight, because every unanswered question creates another possibility, another suspect, another theory, another night wondering what really happened. And perhaps the most disturbing thought is this: if the wrong man was arrested, the real killer was never punished. Saga Prefecture eventually returned to normal. The streets remained. The houses remained. The roads remained. People continued living their lives. But the murders left a permanent shadow. 7 victims, 7 lives interrupted, and a case that became known as the Wednesday Strangler. The nickname sounds almost like something from a horror movie, but behind it were real people. A 12-year-old girl, teenagers, young women, older women, daughters, wives, family members, people whose lives were reduced to dates in a case file. And somewhere behind those dates was a person who may have known exactly what he had done. The accused man was acquitted. The evidence was insufficient to establish his guilt, and the true identity of the killer remains unresolved. Maybe the murderer died years ago. Maybe he moved somewhere far away. Maybe he lived an ordinary life until his death. Or perhaps someone who knew the truth has carried that secret for decades. That's what makes unsolved cases so haunting. There is no final scene, no dramatic confession, no courtroom moment where the truth is finally revealed. Instead, there is silence. And sometimes, silence is the most frightening ending of all. 6 Wednesdays, 7 victims. 14 years of unanswered questions, and a killer who vanished into the ordinary world. The Wednesday Strangler was never given a face, never given a definitive name, and never brought to justice. But the victims remain, and so does the question: who was the man hiding behind the Wednesday murders? Until that question is answered, the case remains one of Japan's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. And somewhere in the old case files, the truth may still be waiting. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.